Welcome back, everyone. This time we're going to look through Scotus's reply to the objections against Aristotle's approach. We're going to try and get through this entire section, and it is quite long, so let's get started and see how far we get. On the basis of these remarks, I can apply to the arguments given above against Aristotle's approach. To the first argument, the one about the sun, I reply that if a natural form is unlimited and is a principle of opposites in materials disposed to receive such opposites, it is determined to produce the opposites just as a form that is a principle of one thing is determined to produce that one thing. For it does not have the power to bring about either this or that form when a patient that is receptive to both forms is present, just as it would not have such a power if it could bring about only one form. The will, by contrast, is not a principle that is of itself determined to its action, whichever of the two opposites within its power it actually does. Rather, it has the power to determine itself to either of them, and this shows how the analogy given above about heat and cold contained unitively in one and the same thing fails. And indeed, not to belabor the point, there is simply no suitable analogy that could be offered, since will is distinguished from the class of active principles that are not will on the basis of their opposite ways of acting. The first half of that was understandably a bit complex. I stumbled a little bit through it, so I apologize. But let's look at this to remind us of the example concerning the sun. He was saying how, the power of the sun produces opposites. It melts water, so it makes water soft, or wax soft, I think is another common version of this. But it makes clay hard. It softens water or softens wax, and it hardens clay. Okay, so this seems to make the sun, or at least the heat of the sun or the rays of the sun, a power for opposites, opposite results. This is, of course, not quite correct, and he says this, he points out that it has to do with the disposition of the patient, the passive thing, the thing that is acted upon. Right? So if it is the kind of thing which when heated becomes soft, then it will become soft as a result of being heated. If, on the other hand, it is the kind of thing that will become hard when heated, like clay, then it'll become hard when exposed to the rays of the sun. It isn't that the sun is capable of producing opposite effects. The sun has one power, which is to heat. It's just that heating can produce subsequent effects in different things differently. And we see here when he says this or that form when a patient that is receptive to both forms, right? So that's where he's saying, well, okay, if the sun were capable of imparting its causal power onto something which is capable of both hardening and softening given heat, and I can't really think of any examples of this, and he doesn't provide us any. So if there were such a thing, if acted upon in the very same way could have one or the other effect, right? Something that is indeterminate or random or simply capable of opposites itself, right? So like something rational. If that were the case, then it would not produce both, right? What it produces would be determined by the object it is acting upon, not the action of the sun. And he also wants to point out here that, well, he says, well, it seems like no suitable analogy could be offered, right? And he wants to emphasize this, right, for fear of belaboring the point. He wants to say, look, there is nothing else like the will. The will is the only thing like this. So trying to compare it to other things by analogy is necessarily doomed to fail because there's nothing quite analogous to the will. All right, so let's move on to the next section. And for this reason, it seems perfectly ridiculous to apply universal propositions about active principles to the will on the grounds that there is no counterexample to these propositions in anything other than the will. For the will is unique in being unlike other active powers, and so one should not deny that the will is F just because other active powers are not F. There is, after all, no contradiction involved in asserting that a creative active principle is capable of the perfection that I have attributed to the will, namely, that not only is it determined to one effect or act, but because it has many effects and acts in its power, but is also not determined to any of the effects or acts for which it has sufficient power. For who would deny that an active principle is more perfect and less dependent, determined, and limited it is with respect to its act or effect? And if you grant this to be true of a power that is unlimited with respect to many contrary effects, though naturally determined to any given one of them, how much greater perfection should you acknowledge in a principle that, in addition to this first kind of unlimitedness, has a second? For this contingency is nobler than necessity, as I discussed in Book 5, in the question raised there on the chapter on the necessary, arguing that it is a matter of perfection in God that he causes nothing necessarily. Therefore, given that this perfection that we attribute to the will is not impossible for a created active principle, and that the will is supreme among such principles, reason demands that we attribute such perfection to the will, and this explanation is better than the one given earlier about heat and cold united in a single thing. Okay, minor point. Again, I want to remind everyone that when he talks about necessity and contingency here, he's talking about contingency and necessity in cause. Contingency in the sense of could be otherwise, not contingent upon something prior to it, right? So he's talking about contingent actions rather than contingent beings, necessary actions rather than necessary beings. By contrast, again, if we look at something like what Aquinas talks about, or any of the other scholastics, when they talk about necessity, they're usually talking about necessary beings, and usually that is God, or even necessary propositions which rely on nothing prior. They could not be otherwise, versus contingent beings which could be otherwise. Contingent beings which rely on something else for their existence and for the way that they are, and contingent propositions that could be otherwise and rely on antecedent propositions for them to be true. What Scotus is talking about here is contingency in action, right? That there is nothing, there is no antecedent cause which determines a contingent action. The thing is caused from nothing other than itself, right? And so we say that God acts contingently in Scotus's sense here. What that means is that God acts and there is nothing determining God to act in the way that he does other than God's own will, God's own choice. And he wants to apply the same principle to human will. He wants to say that human will acts of pure contingency, that human will could, in principle, act contrary to the way that it does. There's nothing antecedent, there's no antecedent cause of the will's choice. It simply chooses. It does not act necessarily. In other words, there's nothing that determines it to act one way or the other. It determines itself to act one way or the other. So that's what he's talking about here with this last distinction, and that is important to note, because this is very much contrary to how we would think of this in the ordinary scholastic context. We ordinarily think of necessary being as greater and more nobler and a greater perfection than contingent being. I mean, if we're talking about beings, if we're talking about essences, if we're talking about truths, that would be the case. Right? And he's not denying that. It's important to note that he's not disagreeing with the more Thomistic or earlier scholastic principle here. He's talking about something else entirely. He's talking about contingency of action. He's talking about the freedom to act, this superabundant sufficiency, which he was mentioning a couple of chapters ago. And that's really what he's explaining here in the first part, right? When he says that an active principle is more perfect the less dependent, determined, and limited it is with respect to its act or effect, right? So it's not limited in its effect, and it's not limited by the kinds of effects that it can produce. So it's capable of producing any number of things, meaning that power or that active principle is greater, it is more perfect. It's nobler, right? Rather than something which is determined purely to one end and determined by antecedent causes to a particular end. All right. So let's continue. On this basis, the argument that Aristotle seems to give in the text can be given a more expansive treatment as follows. If the intellect, through one and the same cognition, has in some way to do with opposites, as presented then, it follows that a more indeterminate active power can have to do with opposites in a more excellent way, namely that such a power, while remaining a single power, can determine itself to either of the opposites presented to it. Otherwise, the first power for opposites would evidently have been given in vain, since without the second power it could do neither of them. Thus, this is an argument from the lesser, not an argument from the proper cause, since knowledge is not the proper cause of this distinction. So in other words, again, what he's saying here is that the intellect is not a power for opposites in the same sense. It is determined to its effects by the way that it acts. When it is presented with the truth, it cognizes the truth, and that's all there is to it. The intellect is more like a stomach than it is like a will, to use the tired turn of phrase that I've kept using here. Continuing on. Reply to the second argument. Aristotle excludes the will from counting as a rational power only if you are talking about what is incompletely a rational power, namely, what has knowledge of opposites. Now, he says that this incomplete rational power does not cause an external effect unless it is determined by something else. I ask, what is the source of this determination through choice? It has to be from a power that chooses, and thus a power distinct from reason. For reason is not what determines, since reason has to do with opposites with respect to which it cannot determine itself, let alone determine something other than itself. Or, if it did determine itself, it would bring about opposites at the same time, as Aristotle argues about action. And the intellect does not necessarily determine that other thing to that opposite. So the other thing contingently determines itself, and once it has become determinate through its own act, it consequently determines itself, and once it has become determinate through its own act, it consequently determines the intellect. So this is where Scotus is having some fun, I think, basically interpreting Aristotle as saying the opposite of what Aristotle says. So here he's being, maybe we can say he's being overly charitable in not wanting Aristotle to be flat out wrong, right? He doesn't want to disagree with Aristotle, because Aristotle is a respectable intellectual authority. He was a smart guy. We want to assume that Aristotle was right about things because he wasn't dumb. But at the same time, Scotus wants to say, well, he only said that he only said that the will is not a rational power, in that it's not an incompletely rational power. Knowledge and the intellect and cognition, those are rational powers, but only incompletely rational powers. See what he's doing here? He's basically saying, well, Aristotle's talking about rational powers, but he's not talking about rational powers in the fullest and most robust sense that I am. Right? I'm really talking about rational powers here, and I'm talking about the will. Aristotle is talking about things which are rational in a limited sense, or in an incomplete sense, but not really. Right? He's saying that the will is the really rational power. It is capable of bringing about either opposite, rather than simply capable of two different things, and what it does is determined by what object it perceives, right? So, which is the case with the intellect, right? So the will here is indeterminate. It determines itself rather than being determined by things outside itself, and that's what. So Scotus is saying that what that is that's what Aristotle really should have meant by a rational power. Right? If you take Aristotle's understanding of a rational power to its logical conclusion, then we would have to conclude that only the will is rational, that the intellect isn't quite. It's incompletely rational. It's kind of rational. It's involved in rational action, right? But it is still determined by something outside of itself. And Scotus is going to say in large part that thing outside of itself that it's determined by is the will. All right, so let's go on. So Aristotle indicates that a rational power is of itself a power for opposites in the sense that it determines itself to one or the other. And he affirms that once it has determinately elicited its act, it is determined with respect to the act of an external power, that of itself was a power for opposites in the sense that, necessarily, it could not determine itself. And thus, in the course of showing in Chapter 4 how an incomplete rational power proceeds to act, he evidently indicates quite clearly that there is another rational power that is complete in terms of the distinction he draws here, and that those two powers, with their acts, cooperate in producing the external effect, properly speaking, the executive power, which is rational by participation, has no power for the opposite. Rather, the full character of a power for opposites is formally in the will. So again, what he's saying here is he's pointing out that Aristotle talks about the intellect as a rational power. But by Aristotle's criteria, if we take them to their fullest extent, right, being capable of opposites, not just being capable of one opposite at one time, the other opposite at another time, or under different circumstances. If we're talking about a power for opposites in the same circumstances, right, something which is capable of eliciting opposite actions, then the rational power must be the will, and the intellect is only related to that rational power. It's used in the execution of that rational power. So what he's doing here is he's taking what Aristotle has to say, and like I said, he is extrapolating on it and trying to expand on it and sort of correct Aristotle. He's trying to produce here what Aristotle should have said, at least in Scotus's mind. So continuing on. As for what Aristotle goes on to say, that a rational power has been thus determined is necessarily a power for one thing, and that what it chiefly desires is what it will do. One could say that this is not true with absolute necessity. For just as the antecedent, it wills this, is not necessary, if it is true at all, so too the consequent, it does this external act, is also necessary. But if what follows necessarily is one wills this external thing, therefore, if not impeded, one does it, Aristotle would merely be claiming that no effect is brought about except by a cause that has been determined to that effect before producing it, understanding before as indicating natural priority. With the sole exception of the will, which follows the apprehension of opposites and, according to Aristotle, determines which external effect will follow. So he's responding to what's called the intellectualist objection here. Right? This goes back before Aristotle to Plato, who claimed that to know the good is to do the good, which is ostensibly at least a quote from Socrates. But this is carried through in the Platonic and the Aristotelian traditions. Right? To know, to cognize something as worth desiring, as that which is chiefly desired, is simply to do it. It is to will it. Right? That's what will is for an intellectualist, somebody like Thomas Aquinas. That's what will means. Will is the appetitive arm of the intellect. It's intellectual appetite. Right? It's a kind of desire. Right? So Scotus here is playing off of that, and he's saying he's equating will and desire here, but he's saying that to desire is only determined by itself, right? Because it's the will. And so when he reinterprets this as saying is, so reading this quote again, one wills this external thing, therefore, if not impeded, one does it. Right? So here he's just saying, well, once you make a choice, you're going to choose it. And he's kind of reducing Aristotle's claim to being trivial, like to following after the choice of the will. Whereas the actual choice of the will is, according to Scotus, determined only by itself. It is not determined by any act of the intellect, by any cognition, by anything innately desirable about the object of willing. It is merely determined by nothing other than the will's choice itself. So continuing on. One could explain his remarks at the end of chapter 4. Hence, it is not the case that if one wills opposites, one necessarily does them, etc. Along the same lines. For why doesn't this follow in the case of the will? And yet he argues earlier in the beginning of the chapter on rational power that doing opposites at the same time is a good basis for the distinction between rational and non-rational power, because a power will act as it has the power to act, though in fact no power can act in this way. So again, he's basically saying the same thing, that the same distinction applies in any case you apply to it having to do with the will. Then, as I have explained, an incomplete rational power is of itself a natural power with respect to opposites. For that reason, as far as the power itself is concerned, it is not only a power at the same time for opposites, but even a power for opposites at the same time. And so if of itself it did those things, it would do them at the same time in the same way that the sun is a power for opposites at the same time in diverse recipients, and would bring about those opposites at the same time if those recipients were brought close to it. And if it were a power for both opposites equally, and one and the same patient equally receptive of both were brought near it, either it would do nothing, or it would bring about both opposites in it at the same time. So it is in the present case. So basically what he's saying here is the intellect, being what he calls an incomplete rational power, is just a natural power when it comes to opposites. It works just like the sun. The sun is a power for opposites in this really derivative sense, in which it can produce opposite effects in different things which are disposed differently, right? Different things with different forms. But it is not the power for opposites in the sense that the will is capable of doing A and capable of doing not A at the same time in the same respect. It can choose between one or the other. The intellect is not a rational power in that sense. It is a natural power. Continuing, one might object that the intellect is not a power for both opposites equally, and so it would act according to whatever has more influence over it. I reply that in the case of the one cognition of a positive feature and its privation, the intellect is indeed not related to both equally. It cognizes the positive feature per se and the privation per accidens. But it can also have a cognition of one opposite and a distinct knowledge of the other, and thereby it can be the cause of opposites. One might also object, how then will Aristotle's inference that rational powers deal with opposites, though not in the same way, be any good? I reply, this is not how things are in the case of the will. For if it is a power for opposites virtually, it is at one and the same time a power for both of them, although not a power for both of them at one and the same time. For it is not a power for both in the mode of a natural power. Rather, it can determine itself to one in preference to the other, and therefore act accordingly. And perhaps this gives us a way to interpret chapter 4, so that it speaks very much in favor of the will as a rational power, though there is evidently some material there that speaks against the will. So in other words here, he's just ruling out alternatives. I hope this is relatively clear. He's just pointing out the same thing he has pointed out before, that the will is a rational power insofar as it is the power for opposites in this full, robust sense. It's capable of doing one or the other thing. Whereas natural powers, like the intellect or like any other, they might be capable of opposites in a limited sense, but only because the things they are causing are disposed to opposite effects from the same cause. There is one note here that I think is particularly relevant. And that is when he says that it is a power for opposites virtually. Virtually here doesn't mean only kind of, like we might mean it. It doesn't mean like in the sense of virtual reality, that kind of thing. That's a very much a later meaning. Virtually is a very precise technical term in scholastic philosophy, and it means it has the power to do something rather than having it innately. The best illustration of this is if I say if I have $20 actually. What I might mean by that in the most actual sense is that I have a $20 bill. At the same time, if I say I have $20 virtually, it means I have something which allows me to acquire $20. Whether that is a debit card that allows me to withdraw it, or whether that is I know where I can get it, right? So if it's in the other room and I need to go and get it, it means I have it virtually, right? I own the thing, right? I own the money. It's just I don't have it on my person. I don't have it as actually as if I had the bill in my hand. I have it virtually. I have the capability of producing it, right? So that's what he's talking about here in terms of the will's power for opposites. The will's power for opposites is virtual in this sense, meaning that the will is capable of producing opposites rather than it being capable of acting in a certain way, which can then produce opposites. Right? Okay, so let's continue. But then one might ask why Aristotle so frequently calls the intellect a rational power and does not do so for the will, even though, if my previous exposition is correct, he does imply that the will is a rational power. One could reply that an act of the intellect is typically prior to the act of the will, and it is better known to us. Aristotle quite often spoke in terms of what is more evident, and that is why we find him saying so little about the will, even though there are certain implications of what he did say, which he would have drawn explicitly if he had discussed those issues. Okay, well, the easy answer to his question here Why didn't Aristotle talk about the will as a rational power is that Aristotle doesn't talk about a faculty of the will. He doesn't talk about the will as a power at all. He talks about prohairesis, or the act of choosing, choice. He doesn't talk about the will in the same way he talks about the intellect. And neither do most of the scholastics. Most of the scholastics talk about the will as part of the intellect rather than an independent or separate power from the intellect. And this is also kind of in line with what he's saying here, right? He says that an act of intellect is typically prior to an act of will, right? So the act of the intellect is the antecedent of the act of will, right? The will acts because, in a sense, because of the act of the intellect, right? The intellect provides the raw materials for the will to act upon, that sort of thing, right? The intellect presents the choices to the will. So the act of the intellect does come first. The intellect figures out what the various goods are, and then the will chooses one. Most prior thinkers think of this, sort of see this as the actions of one power. They don't pull these two things apart, whereas Scotus does. And I think part of the reason Scotus does is to first of all head off charges of determinism. He doesn't want to say that we are determined by what we perceive to be or cognize to be better, right? Because that leads to a kind of intellectualist determinism that he saw and criticized in contemporary writers like Thomas Aquinas. It's also because, again, the thing that the scholastics do is draw distinctions. That's their favorite thing to do all the time. There is never a time when scholastics are not drawing careful distinctions between things. In this case, Scotus found a new distinction that is useful to make. There are important differences between these two parts of any given action that prior thinkers had kind of brought in under the same power. Scotus says, well, these are clearly two different things going on. And you can even, it seems, you can have one without the other. You can have an act of intellect without an associated act of willing. And you might be able to have an act of will that does not have a preceding act of the intellect. Although he doesn't really give examples of those, and so it might not really be possible. But you can certainly separate these, at least to an extent. And so he wants to say, look, if we can separate them and they work in different ways, and one of them seems to be a natural power and one of them seems to be a rational power, as long as we separate them out, then call them different powers. And so that's what he does. He draws the distinction, he makes the distinction, and he very carefully lays out throughout this entire commentary what that distinction is and why it is important. The third argument offered against Aristotle has a true conclusion, namely that in the case of a simple apprehension there is distinct cognition of two contraries, each being cognized through its proper species. Nonetheless, if one contrary is naturally prior to the other, discursive cognition can be a source of knowledge about the other posterior contrary. And this is a way to interpret Aristotle's dictum in De Anima 1, that the straight is the judge of both itself and the curved. For judgment does not pertain to simple apprehension, but to a comparison of propositions. For with respect to knowledge secundum quid, one thing can be apprehended by simple apprehension through the species of something else, in terms of the privation of that species includes, not of course with its essence or essential character, but as a concomitant. So what he's saying here is much simpler than it sounds. He's saying that we cognize or understand things through comparison. Right, we compare opposites, and so we understand something through its opposite or through its privation. And so that's part of why Aristotle says in this, again, very limited sense that he's talked about already, that the intellect is a power for opposites. Scotus is saying, it is true, yes it is, but he goes on to show why that does not mean that it is a rational power in the robust sense. In the first way, then, there is a single condition of contraries, cognition of one formally and the other virtually, as in the case of cognition of a principle and a conclusion. And if some volition, say perhaps choice, requires a prior judgment about what is to be chosen, one of the contraries can be cognized through the other as far as that cognition is concerned, even though one might sometimes choose contrary to that judgment. In the second way, there is a single cognition of contraries, cognition of one secundum quid and the other unqualifiedly. And this cognition is all that the will needs in order to will either of the contraries, insofar as each is presented in that cognition. And the will can will contraries in this way. Therefore, it can also do so unqualifiedly. For the contraries are not incompatible absolutely, except perhaps by reason of such privation. They are evidently not incompatible as willable, since both are evidently willable as positive beings. So he's kind of setting up two ways that this can work. One being you can cognize two things separately, right? You can think of one thing and think of it sort of in comparison with another thing that you have thought of. The other thing is kind of in the back of your mind, virtually. It's there, you can think of it. You're kind of holding it out as a comparison, but it isn't the primary object of your cognition. Right? So you can think of this first way as two separate acts of cognition. You think of the one thing, and then you kind of keep it in the back of your mind and think of the other thing. Right? And so what this means is the intellect is now only really considering one thing, and that's what it presents the will with, and the will can choose to accept it or reject it in light of the other thing that is sort of there. The second way is a single act of cognition, a cognition of contraries as contrary. So you're looking at not the two things, but looking at the comparison of the two things as its own object. Right? So that in that case, what the will is saying is the will is then making a judgment on the comparison of the two things, rather than the will simply choosing yes or no with respect to the single object of cognition. What it's doing is it is oscillating. It's choosing, not oscillating. It has the alternative to choose between the two. Okay. You might say that a rational power is a power for opposites unless it has been determined to one, and then it isn't. On the contrary, from this it follows that there is no distinction between rational and non-rational powers on the basis of their being or not being a power for opposites. The consequent is false, according to Metaphysics 9. Therefore, so is the antecedent. Proof of the inference. Non-rational powers, both active and passive, as naturally prior to the determining act, can produce opposites, as is evident from Aristotle, De Interpretatione 2, and Boethius, Commentary on De Interpretatione 6, second edition, where he offers the example of water, which can both chill and heat. Also, if a rational power could not produce opposites when it is actually determinate, that is, in and for this instant, no effect in actual being would be actually contingent. The consequent is false, therefore so is the antecedent. The falsity of the consequent is evident from the philosopher in De Interpretatione 1, where he holds that one must qualify the proposition everything that is, when it is, necessarily is, because something exists contingently. Proof of this inference. An effect is said to be contingent in potentiality only in virtue of the fact that its cause has the power for the opposite. Therefore, an effect is not contingent in actuality unless its cause in actually causing could cause the opposite in the very now in which it causes that effect. But on your view, it cannot now cause the opposite. Because of that point, it has been determined, therefore, etc. Small note, that last thing, therefore, etc., probably my favorite of Scotus, Scotus's little aphorisms. Basically, he's saying, yeah, you can follow the rest of the argument through to its conclusion. So what he's saying here, the conclusion that he wants us to draw is that, well, since the contingent cause of something is itself contingent, right? So the causal sequence kind of falls back to something prior. So if there's a sequence of necessary effects, it has to ultimately culminate in some contingent cause, in some cause which has to be contingent, which could be otherwise. Right? So what we're saying is that if something is, right? So Aristotle's claim about the necessity of the present, what something is, the truth of the matter is necessarily true because it's true. He says that, but also it may have been caused contingently, right? It could have been otherwise, even if it could not be otherwise. right? I'm saying this sentence now. There's no way that I can say a different sentence despite saying this sentence, if that made any sense. However, I could have chosen before the fact to say a different sentence, right? It may be necessary in that I say it, but I could have done differently. So this is the difference between contingency, between something being necessarily true and something existing contingently, right? It exists contingently because it's contingent upon an antecedent effect, right? And that antecedent effect could have been otherwise. Therefore, the thing is contingent, not strictly necessary. Like the truth of it might be strictly necessary, but the thing itself is not. And so if you follow back any causal sequence like this, you will ultimately get to some kind of contingent cause. And whether that is an agent cause, like a created agent cause, like a human or an angel, causing like an act of will, or if it's an act of the divine will, if it's an act of creation. In either case, you have to ultimately culminate in a contingent cause. Otherwise everything would wind up being necessary, absolutely necessary, and could not be otherwise. And that's absurd for reasons he lays out elsewhere. You might say that an effect is called contingent because it can fail to come about. On the contrary, it wasn't a being before it was brought about. Therefore, it wasn't an actually contingent effect before it was brought about. For we are speaking now of contingency as a mode of being in actuality, when it is in actuality, and in the very now in which it is in actuality. So what he's saying here is I think, hopefully quite clear. He's pointing out that that this definition of contingency isn't quite precise, and it can't quite be that a contingent thing can fail to be, because a contingent thing clearly is, right? It does exist. It's just that it could have been different if things had gone differently. That's really that's the only distinction he's drawing here. He's saying that it's not that a contingent thing can fail to be, it's that it could have. Right? It could have been different if things were different. It relies on antecedent factors, or it relies on things going differently, that sort of thing. So hopefully that's relatively clear. The next part is a little bit more confusing, so let's try it. Also, the opposite of what belongs to something per se and primarily does not belong to that thing either per se or per accidens, as long as the thing remains itself. Otherwise, propter quid demonstration, which derives a passion from its subject, would not proceed from necessary truths. Now, being a power for opposites belongs to a rational power in its own right and primarily, as a proper passion of a rational power qua rational. For this is precisely how a rational power is distinguished from a non-rational power, according to Metaphysics 9, therefore, etc. This is probably much more simple than it sounds. He's making this sound a bit more complex than it probably needs to, at least for the most part. His main point here, I think, is basically a re-emphasis of the law of non-contradiction. So he's basically emphasizing that it's a quality that belongs to something per se, an essential property of something, cannot be contradicted. Right? The same thing, that the same object or being cannot have a quality and have its opposite or its negation at the same time in the same way. Right? So that's why he says the opposite does not belong to a thing either per se in itself or per accidens, accidentally or through something else, as long as it remains itself, right? As long as it is the thing that it is. And then the next part, that is just his way of saying, otherwise we couldn't do logic, right? Because if we violate the law of non-contradiction, we can't think about things in a coherent manner. And so he's drawing from this sort of obvious premise, stated pretty carefully to apply to this example. He's just using this to conclude that the same power cannot be both rational and natural at the same time in the same respect, right? Because if it were, then that would be a contradiction in its essence. And so this is part of why he wants to make that distinction that we were talking about earlier, making this careful distinction between intellect and will. It's not just that they seem to have different ways of functioning. It's not just that they seem to have different objects and they operate independently. But more importantly, it's that one, the will, if the will is a rational power in the fullest, most robust sense, then it cannot be a natural power, right? Because that would mean that it is both, it both has a quality and its opposite, and that's impossible, right? That would be a contradiction, and so it cannot be both rational and non-rational. In other words, both rational and natural. And so if we have something that looks like one power, the intellect, as the scholastic tradition kind of referred to it, that appears to be both natural in its capacity for cognizing intellectual objects, cognizing concepts, but also rational in the sense of discerning between opposites, like the will does, like he explains the will to do, then it can't simply be one power. It has to be two separate powers, one being rational and one being natural. That's why he makes this distinction. Also, God cannot predestine someone who is predestinate in and for the very now in which he predestined that person, notwithstanding the determination of his will through an act of predestining. Everyone agrees with this. Therefore, this determination does not take away the power for opposites. Now, he says everyone agrees with this. This is at the time before the Protestant Reformation, before Calvin and his double predestination theory, where God fully determines the will of creatures. He's still working on a more or less a scholastic framework, broadly speaking, a Thomistic framework. The idea that God predestines and it predestines those who will choose to accept the gift of grace. Right? That's what God's predestination is. So he's working on what we call a synergistic model of soteriology or salvation theory. Right? He's pointing out that when God chooses to predestine certain people to salvation or to grace, what's going on there is he chooses those who are predestinate. In other words, those who will accept the gift of grace. Now this is treated much more carefully. The sort of mechanics of this relationship, both by Scotus and by Anselm, on roughly the same model in each of their treatises on the fall of the devil. I recommend both of these texts for if you're interested in this issue in particular, the relationship between free will and providence. Or God's will and creatures' wills. But the important thing to note here is that what he's really doing for our purposes, for the purposes of this objection, is he is making sure that God's predestination does not conflict with the will being a rational power. In other words, a will being absolutely free and even, we might say, sovereign. Right? He wants to maintain the absolute freedom of the will as this absolute rational power which is capable of choosing between opposites. So that's the key point here. The key point here is not really to do with predestination. He's just saying that, well, this could be a potential objection, but here's why it doesn't work. So that's all. That's all that he needs to do with this point here. So that pretty much wraps up the replies to the objections. And all we have left now is the conclusion, but we will pick that up in the next video. So until then, have a good one.